talking about. I guess it's something that probably all musicians go through, where you have this idea, this picture, this feel, and just making it happen is such a different task.
Hi, I'm Vlad Bresnix, and welcome to the third episode of the BresnixCast. So in this episode, I had the pleasure of talking to Paul Lemos. Now, Paul's the man behind the excellent experimental band Controlled Bleeding. It's a great conversation, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. Hi, so I'm here with Paul Lemos, who you'll know as the complete force behind Controlled Bleeding. Paul, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Vlad.
Oh, well, it's great to have you on, actually. And I kind of want to do this by starting, just kind of at the very start. So, I know, I've read before that you said early on you were quite influenced by punk and prog. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I was always kind of an avid music collector, from the time I was a little kid, listening to older guys' psychedelic records and a lot. I was just always attuned to music from the first time I heard stuff when I was like 5 years old. It was like an instant adrenaline rush. I remember first time I heard anything but, the jazz that my father was playing. So, it was kind of a natural progression for me to explore as many genres as were available to me. And I was fortunate when I was, young, like maybe when I was like 8 or 9, that I had some older friends in, the place where I lived in the summer in Boston, and they would turn me on to, interesting bands, bands that normally I wouldn't have the opportunity to hear among, I don't know, in school among my peers, so I was, introduced to groups like the Velvet Underground and King Crimson and early Pink Floyd and, some kind of pretty avant-garde stuff for the time. And a lot of it I didn't understand when I was young, but it kind of gestated in there. And then that kind of, led to an interest in maybe, more avant-garde things like Henry Cow and Magma and those bands. But by the same token, I always got a tremendous rush from really visceral rock. I brought in 6th grade, I remember when I was a little kid, I probably was, I don't know, whenever it was released, I brought, the Stooges Funhouse to show and tell. And so when I was a little kid, that was a life changer for me, getting Funhouse for Christmas and listening to the second Stooges record, and I loved that record so much. So there was always that kind of, that enjoyment of the really visceral kind of rock experience combined with something of a more cerebral, maybe prog experience.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that's something I understand as well, because I know what you mean, because I'm kind of the same in that way, where, it's always I like a million different genres of music, but it's I know what you mean as well. See, when you talked about being in 6th grade and that, it's see, when you're young and you first hear that, and I listened to Stooges when I was quite young as well, and I think when you first get that first experience of really visceral rock, and you and you really feel it, especially when you've never really been exposed to that before, I found that as well to be something that was totally life-changing for me too.
Yeah, and I think, young boys particularly, I know that I was always looking for the most visceral kind of, the most aggressive rock I could find. When I was in high school, it was like early Blue Oyster Cult, like Tyranny and Mutation, and maybe the MC5s, Kick Out the Jams, and White Light, White Heat, and the Stooges. So it was always that desire for some kind of extreme experience. And I think young males particularly, just, in terms of the way they vent or whatever, I just needed that. I was just so wired up, and then, when I was introduced maybe to the world of women, when I got into college and calmed down a little bit, I didn't need that quite so much. But yeah, I always found that music just still, at this point, I'm almost 60 and I still get that same kind of depth charge from listening to, similar music.
Yeah, that's amazing. The thing with me, when I was sort of, say, at school at that time, would have been the 90s for me, when I was kind of younger at school, and when I first heard Norwegian black metal, that was like something I was like, well, what's going on here? You know, and that was the most aggressive.
Yeah, well, I always think I would have lost my mind. Like if I was a kid to listen to Hell Nation or Portal, you know, if there was Dillinger Escape, I mean, the music I was listening to was so tame comparatively. Oh yeah, I would have just been like out of my fucking mind.
Oh yeah, totally. So also like the industrial genre has been a big thing with you as well, Paul. Were you into industrial music kind of early on?
Yeah, you know, again, always kind of looking for that next extreme, always kind of seeing what's bubbling underground. I think when I first heard, actually, the record that really just blew me out of my shoes was when I heard Einstürzan's collabs. I happened to come upon it for like $1. There was an import store that was just getting all kinds of promos from all over the world and seeing if they'd distribute them and just throwing them out in bins for no money. And I bought this thing just quite by accident before the band really even surfaced. I bought that, and there were a couple of Neubauten cassettes even. And yeah, collapse just gave me a very different idea of how I could approach things, you know, in a much more visceral kind of, I don't know, just kind of a primal scream way that I never considered. So that was a real inspiration. And at the time, I didn't even consider it industrial music. I mean, I loved the idea that they were using the instruments of industry. But as far as a genre, it really wasn't articulated as industrial music. But that kind of set me on a very different course in terms of the music that I wanted to pursue.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I know, like, I'm not even I hate trying to pronounce that band name. I just call them, like, I just usually use the initials. But I know that I think they actually had was it a practice studio that was like, just like underneath a section of the Autobahn or something like that? I remember reading something like that. I would need to look that up, but.
Probably. I mean, I know they did some great video in an area like that. You know, I mean, early on, they were just really, really, really intense. Those first 2 records, it was unlike anything I think that I had heard.
And it was so different as well from like, so when I started getting into industrial music, obviously when I was younger, like everyone knew the big industrial bands like Nine Inch Nails and things like the industrial rock bands we might call them now, you know. But like when I got really into it, I started getting into like Throbbing Gristle, and I noticed Throbbing Gristle was the one band that really like blew my mind like wide open. But like, and I noticed like it's interesting, but you know, because we use this, industrial's become quite a broad sort of term just now, you know, like because, well, over the years, because you have all these different bands, you know, you had sort of EBM bands and things, and then you had like the band whose name I can't pronounce, I'm just going to call them the Autobahn band. But then they were more kind of percussive and aggressive, but then you had like, obviously Throbbing Gristle were one of the original ones, and it was like, I mean, try to characterize what they did as visceral doesn't even cover it for me, if you know what I mean.
Well, you know, it's funny because I heard Throbbing Gristle, you know, early on, and I wanted it to be much more. I wanted it to be like Blood on the Floor, you know. I wanted it to be just an extreme noise experience, but I didn't really understand the depth of Throbbing Gristle at the time, you know. So they didn't give me that full on that complete onslaught that maybe some like the early Broken Flag stuff did. I think that I could understand Throbbing Gristle, like the depth of that band artistically, more later. You know, because it's strange. I mean, Throbbing Gristle records were coming out when, you know, like the early Pere Ubu stuff was coming out. It was coming out in that whole post-punk period. And yeah, for me, it's like when I heard this, I wanted it to be louder and I wanted it to be uglier and even, you know, just complete balls to the wall. And so when I made Knees and Bones, I guess it was kind of like what I wanted to hear. That was the genre, or that was the kind of thing that I wanted to hear on a record, you know, taking maybe Throbbing Gristle and, you know, just kind of pumping it full of steroids.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because a lot of it is kind of melancholic and stuff like that, and I think a lot of that comes from the fact that they grew up in that kind of post-industrial Manchester. But like, I know what you mean though, but like that makes sense with the Knees and Bones thing, like taking it and putting the, you know, the aggression into it.
Yeah, because Throbbing Gristle, I mean, it really was. There was a lot of textural depth to what they were doing, you know, and I think that the parts of Throbbing Gristle that I really thrived on were those super aggressive parts. But again, that was just because of my personal need at the time, you know. Yeah, I didn't have a lot of room for subtlety. I think it was just, the incredible frustration of playing really fast, intense music, counting measures for a long time, and just a band imploding. And then it was total liberation to just experiment with pure sound, pure noise.
Yeah, I like the constraints have gone, the constraints of time and rhythm, and you can just really be free just to play with what's almost like you can make it like a stream of consciousness sort of thing, if you know what I mean.
That's what I think is kind of going on with really, extreme metal bands. I mean, that's why I think they respond to artists like Merzbow, like a band from Hell that had their Merzbow remix and stuff, because, what's left after you're playing just, as fast, is just humanly possible. What's the next step? And so I think, that idea of just going over that line of just total noise and complete freedom of expression, kind of like, free jazz artists. I mean, when Coltrane did Om or whatever, here's a guy that could play so perfectly, he was a great technician, but it just doesn't necessarily express formal music, the kinds of urgency that you want. And so, yeah, I thought that's what inspires me about free jazz, is just you have these really, great technicians that are just going right over that border, into just that complete noise expression.
Mm. Oh, actually, this is a personal aside, but I feel like I'll just throw it in. Last week I went to see, that band Sun, spelled with Sun, two N's.
Yeah.
Thing. I went to see them in Glasgow there, Sunday the 16th, and that was just one of the loudest, craziest, like, most unbelievable things I've seen in a long time, and that was just like...
Is it just bass tone?
Sorry?
Is it mostly just like bass tones, just low end that just vibrates the shit out of the venue?
Yeah, and then they do have that guy, I can't remember his name, the Hungarian guy who used to sing with Mayhem and things. So they've got vocals, and then it is really low tones, and then no drums, obviously, just a synthesizer. And this is it's the only gig I've ever been to where there's like signs up saying like free noise protection available behind the bar. Like for like ear protection, like, you know what I mean? Like, they were actually giving away free earphones. Like, it was needed. It was loud.
I think the guy's name is Stephen O'Malley, right? That's behind that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Interested. Yeah, he like works with a composer I really like named Dimitrescu.
Uh-huh.
I think Inacu Dimitrescu. I know he's part of that, and Inacu Dimitrescu does some pretty incredible, much more academic composition. So O'Malley, he's coming from some interesting places. I haven't experienced Sun live, and the records they're probably a pale in comparison.
Mm. Oh, yeah, I highly recommend it. It's the whole thing is an experience. But back to you, Paul, right? So see in the early days, so when like you started out, what kind of clubs were you playing in at the time? Like, what kind of crowds were you bringing in that era?
Well, before, I mean, the early lineups of Controlled Bleeding, before I, kind of moved into complete abstraction with Knees and Bones and stuff like that. I mean, we were playing, very rigorous kind of prog punk inspired music in places like CBGB's. Would be on the same bill with my friend Brian Setzer's band. Before the Stray Cats, he played in a band called Bloodless Pharaohs, and so we were, and we'd support them. And Suicide would be on those bills. But yeah, nothing happened with that. And so I just got so completely frustrated that when that band imploded, I just kind of embarked on this other direction. And with the early noise, I mean, we didn't really play clubs. That was pretty much just a studio kind of thing, live in a concrete basement, just kind of hammering things out. But yeah, it wasn't really much of a live phenomenon. And, still I think, through the years, I think that Controlled Bleeding has not been much of a live group.
Why is that? Is there any reason why, or is it just how it is?
Well, I mean, I think I'm most comfortable being a guitar player, being a bass player. And, most of the music that we've done over the course of time has not been particularly guitar oriented. And then, of course, when my bandmates passed away on me, that kind of, left me in limbo a bit. And I wasn't quite sure, where I was going to be going musically. I've reestablished, the path, but the live thing is just completely secondary to me. I'm always thinking about the recordings and the sound stuff, and I don't find it easy to reproduce those things in a live context. And so I've never been particularly happy, playing live, unless I'm playing guitar, and that's not something that seems to translate very well in a live setting.
No, it's quite interesting, yeah, because that's something I wondered, because I think I'd remember I'd read that you'd said like you had never really done like a proper tour of like the US and things like that, and it's something that you'd kind of wanted to do.
It's true. I mean, we've played in Europe, but it was always kind of a charade, I thought, going to Europe. But playing with pre-recorded tape, and when we were on Wax Tracks, we kind of did a semi kind of dance industrial set, or as close to that as we could, kind of aggressive and kind of stupid, ham-fisted. I always thought it was kind of a charade. I never felt genuinely comfortable in any of the times we played live. But we're still talking about getting things together with this new music and my new musical partners to try it again. And I think next time we try it, it's going to be done exactly as it should be done.
Well, that sounds good. Come to Scotland. I'll come see you.
I'd like to come to Scotland as a tourist. That's the problem when you play live. You go through all these beautiful places and you can't enjoy any of them.
Yeah, you never get to see it. You're working really.
Keep going. But yeah, so I'm hoping at one point we'll get back to Europe. I miss it. I mean, it would be beautiful.
That would be awesome. I noticed as well, like, so your early stuff came out on like European labels before US labels. Do you think that they just kind of got you here more, or was it just who was listening?
Oh, well, there's no question. I mean, I also think that I had I had a closer relationship to a lot of the European artists. I mean, people like Steve Stapleton and the guys in Coil, and William Bennett from White House. I mean, it was kind of an interesting community of people. We were all kind of in correspondence, the guys in the Syndicate, and a lot of French people and Viennese artists and so forth. So I was quite closely aligned with a lot of the Europeans, and I think that I was much more interested in the European aesthetic. I didn't really find anything particularly interesting in what was going on in America. I didn't feel part of the American tape scene. I didn't like the cassette scene very much. I mean, we'd made cassettes, and some of the people that ran those labels were really supportive of me in the early times, but I never really related to most of the American artists. So yeah, it just kind of made sense that the records would come out in Europe, and that most of, people that would know them or buy them would be Europeans.
That's interesting, because I know, like, when we talk about, you mentioned White House and stuff, and they were English, and like, obviously Thurman Gristle English and stuff like that as well. But even nowadays, like, even though we still have people like coming out just now that make kind of good, kind of noisy stuff, even like more kind of dancey stuff like Factory Floor, still, if you really want to go and like experience this stuff, what's going on nowadays, it's still really like Holland, Germany and stuff, like from what I've seen, that's where that stuff really is going down still, much more so than the UK. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I haven't kept up with it. I haven't really been interested in what's been considered industrial music for a long time. In fact, I found, really that most of the music I like is American music, just kind of skewed rock bands and, bands from Providence, Rhode Island, like Arab Radar, I find to be, that they were just so inspiring to me. So my musical interests have really diverged over the past couple of decades.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, like, I mean, I always think of, like, I've got, like, a wide musical, like, taste, like, I can see that you have as well, and I always think music's like food, you don't always want steak or something like that, like, you don't always want a salad, but I know as well that, like, obviously you've done a lot of different genres, like, even from where you started to doing, like, dub and things like that, it's pretty cool. Do you find that, like, at different times when you've got sort of different feelings, you need to express yourself in, like, a different way?
Oh, there's no question. I think it depends on the people that you work with, the chemistry that develops. Like Joe and I, we could tap into things that we didn't necessarily understand. Like, we did a lot of, guess what you might call almost kind of sacred music. I mean, yeah. I hate that it's been categorized as goth, because it was never a genre I understood or I liked. But what Joe and I were doing tapped into something that was kind of spiritually deep for us. We didn't necessarily know why we were writing that. But, looking back at it, there was a certain sadness and depth of spirituality in the pieces in a lot of the records that we did. And, whereas when I was working with Chris Moriarty, we could tap into a much more violent kind of aggressive music. And that's what would come out even, when we embarked on Skin Chamber. So, I mean, I think the chemistry of the people I work with, has some bearing on that. And also, I think, emotionally where you're at in life certainly colors the music you do. I mean, I know, when I was going through a really kind of very depressing, dark period, I was doing music for Scorching Grounds, and I still listen to that record, and it's just, imbued with a lot of sadness directly from, those days. Whereas maybe, doing something like a project called The Breastfed Yak, it was just born out of, just kind of, we were happy, content, and we could just do something for the fun of doing it. So yeah, I think it always kind of reflects where we are emotionally. And sometimes also reflects the obsessive things I've been listening to, like I was listening to a lot of free jazz and really out psychedelic stuff like The Gods, and that sometimes came out in the Breastfed Yak project.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I totally do see what you're saying. Like sometimes, like, you have these different sort of like, the way you feel just comes out based on like what you're playing or like what you're making and things like that. And I think it fulfills different parts of you, doesn't it? Because like you said, sometimes, I mean, it can be cathartic. Like it's usually cathartic. Like, if you're really into music, sometimes the aggressive stuff, it can get something out of you. But in the same way, something that's more sort of down tempo and that can get something else out of you. It's almost like if you think about that whole model people talk about, like the whole thing that your mind is like a committee around your head. There's the different parts of you. There's the aggressive you, and then there's a happy you, and then there's the sad you, and you're all around the table. And sometimes I think when you do different kinds of music, it's almost like exercising each one of them, but just through a different mode, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think everybody has so many, different sides and, your feelings day to day. I mean, you wake up sometimes and you're just in that kind of rank mood where you want to, just kick the dog. Sometimes you need that outlet. So I think it's very true that there's a certain kind of multi-leveled, that the music has a kind of multi-leveled outlet or can voice different emotions, at times. But I always understand it more in retrospect. Most of the time, I don't really understand where it's coming from when, the recordings are made, but I can see it so much clearly, sometimes years after the fact.
Yeah. Isn't that an incredible thing? Like, I kind of know what you're talking about. Like, it's like you just do something and you won't really think about it. It'll just be what you're doing at the time. And then later on, you'll kind of be like, oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's like writing poetry. I find myself sometimes, sitting down and writing words, and I have no idea why I'm really writing them, but they make sense to me sometimes long after the fact when you can kind of see what you're really writing about. I go generally, just on my intuition. I don't really think about audience or, directing a project towards, a certain, towards its sellability or its marketability. More or less, it's just kind of what develops at the time and what feels right.
Mm-hmm. See, I think that's a more honest way to make music, because how many times have you heard the bands that when they first came out or whatever, they sounded good and then they started making records for the money? Like, you hear that. I'm not going to name any names, but we all can think of someone who's done that, and then it's like they start making the money record, like, and you can tell, and it's different if you make a record that's genuinely like from the heart and it sells well, that's cool, but you can tell that sometimes when people are just, when it goes, if you know what I mean, if they're just doing it for the money and then you just don't feel it anymore. I mean, I'm not averse to people making money, it's just when they intentionally, do it for that reason.
And it's easy to get sidetracked. I mean, when you're doing things in kind of a vacuum and you're just making recordings and they're so obscure, like doing knees and bones or body samples, it's self-expression. But then when you start, gaining recognition and, other things start clouding your judgment, you start making magazine covers and working with bigger labels, then, you start wanting to play that other game and it becomes kind of insidious. And I know, I've compromised myself at points when, there's been money involved or maybe where there's been, much more mass exposure. Then I look back at those recordings and, some of them I still really like, but a lot of them I think, really just, you can see that, It was to play a game. It wasn't creating what necessarily I wanted or what was in my heart, but kind of to follow a certain, a certain pathway to success. And, I mean, that's insidious. Like when somebody comes along and, is going to put, thousands of dollars in your hand for a piece of music, that can kind of fuck up your priorities, you might say.
Just to be clear, Paul, I wasn't referring to you in any way there.
No, I understand that. But I mean, I know from personal experience.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that you say that.
Get sidetracked. I know. No, I'm not. I knew you weren't implying that.
No, I wasn't at all. But I understand what you mean. Like, because I've never been in that situation, and there must be a kind of temptation at that point. So I don't know what that's like. It's easy for me to say like, I don't like that, but I've never been there, so like I don't know what it's like, I don't know how tempting that could be.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes you just get really distracted. Like I know, I've always worked as a school teacher, and I've never wanted to play the role of the starving artist or have to define what I would do, according to expectations, public expectations. So I never had to sell records. I was never under really that much pressure, and because I always had the job that kind of gave me satisfaction. But by the same token, you can never do anything completely, if you don't devote yourself to it 100%, like being a live band, Controlled Bleeding really could never be a live band because I was always burdened with a job, so I could never totally focus my efforts on doing something live that would, that would be successful, that would really make me feel good about the work. It was always shoddily done, So I don't know. I mean, there's two sides to it. I've always been ambivalent about doing music strictly, though.
Yeah, that's interesting because there is other artists like that. I mean, I'm thinking of Fenriz from Darkthrone, the Norwegian black metal band, and he works in the postal service in Norway because he doesn't like playing live and he just refuses to do it, even though Darkthrone are, legendary and, their scene, I mean, legendary metal in general, I would say. But for him, he just doesn't want to play live and that's it.
Yeah, so that's it. So it's a recording band, and people take it as it is.
I mean, the fact that you've been a teacher and that's actually something I kind of do respect about you because, like, it says to me that you are doing, like, what you want to do and you're able to do that, while doing another job. But there is something now that we're onto that. I was going to kind of maybe leave that for the end, but since we're onto it, I'm just interested. Have any of your students ever figured out who you are?
Well, students, yeah, with the internet particularly, they can see every single word you've ever uttered, some of it might be regrettable. Some of it, but there's nothing I can do. Oh yeah, it circulates among them, but they don't really understand it. They're very interested in it. I mean, I have to say a lot of the kids are very interested in experimental music or broadening what they might define as music because their exposures, I mean, really what they're listening to is so limited. So I think they're kind of fascinated, but it's not too much of a distraction for them. I mean, our last record, Larva Lumps, that was a pretty public record in America. That got a lot of good press, and it was a pretty visible release, more visible than anything we'd done in a while. So, of course, kids found out about that, and in the middle of class, maybe they'd say, "Hey, Mr. Lemos, well, what is this?" And it's, they'd start playing this thing on their phone. So they just like to rib me with it, but it's not too much of a distraction among them.
That's quite funny. I just kind of wondered about that because, I never had any teachers like that. I don't think many people do, to be honest.
Yeah, like I play music in class when they come in every day. I might be playing a piece by Penderecki or something by The Locust or whatever it might be, or a Finesse piece. And they're just fascinated that, music like that exists. So for some of them, it's kind of an adventure and they learn, they broaden their taste quite a bit.
Well, that's good. I mean, you're doing what I would consider the Lord's work there, and spreading good music to the children. They need it badly.
Well, some of them come in and they beg me to shut it off. They get a headache. Like they just beg me to shut it off. But then if they come in the next day and there's nothing on, then they bitch that there's no music on. It's a funny reaction.
How can you win? I was going to say as well, you talked as well about working with other people, and we talked about different genres that you've gone through and things like that, and different influences. So How much does your musical process, does it change when you're doing something different, or have some things remained similar through the years about how you make music? You know, like obviously it's different if you're yourself versus with other people, but how has that kind of gone over the years?
You know, the creative process is so strange because there's no consistency to it at all. Again, it's so much of, you know, who you're working with. Like when I would work with Chris or when I would work with Joe, we had just a certain chemistry. So we kind of knew where we would start. Maybe Joey and I would work on composing keyboard lines, and those keyboard lines would then start translating to vocal melodies, and then would start layering maybe percussive ideas. Whereas with Chris, it would always start from, you know, drum parts, playing drums with live bass or live guitar, and start just working on, you know, on kind of aggressive riffs. The guys that I work with now, you know, like Chad SB, I mean, he works in a totally different kind of intuitive way. He likes to start with nothing, maybe a loop, you know, so with Chad, it's kind of, we get a smattering of a whole load of ideas, nothing with particular, you know, no real continuity among any of them. And then we start molding and seeing what's going to work and what's not. It's a very different way of working for me. With the other fellow that works with us, Mike Bazzini, you know, we would start generally with a rhythm and a bass line or a bass loop, and then we'd start honing that to, you know, that one piece until it's, you know, until it's perfected. So I find the creative process is really so much defined by the people that I'm working with.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, like, have you ever had that way as well, where like you kind of go into something, you think, I've had this idea for a song, it's been kicking about your head, I think I'll do it like this, and then you go to actually make something and it doesn't sound anything like what you had in your head, but you're happier with it.
Well, you know, that's always the way it is. It's funny, Chad and I were talking about that, how infrequently it is that you know, that we reproduce something the way we imagine it, because yeah. And, you know, you have to deal with it. It's sometimes so frustrating because you have a very defined image of what the thing should feel like. And you can't necessarily convey that to another person. And I know if I'm not in control of the studio, which I'm not anymore because I'm a real Luddite, I don't know the technology. These guys can they try to bring maybe my ideas, you know, to fruition. But yeah, it's just a rough approximation of what I imagine these days.
Because I know, like, I'd read that you used to, like, record your own stuff earlier on in that. So, see, nowadays, do you take more of a back seat? Do you have, like, more of an engineer and things like that?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's so different because I work in other people's studios, whereas, yeah, generally I used to work in, you know, in my studio, so I don't really have control over the process or the music, and which is, I think, a really good thing because, you know, it becomes a much deeper kind of collaboration. I don't know if I take a back seat, but I have to give a lot more creative leeway to the people I work with. Yeah. So, I mean, like for instance, the last record, you know, the piece, what was it called? The Perks of Being a Perv. That was about a 24-minute piece. And, you know, I supplied a lot of, you know, raw material for it, a lot of sound work, and then Chad kind of sculpted it into something that was very, very different maybe from what I had initially imagined. And it was so much better than what I had imagined. So that's what's exciting, you know, and so, yeah. And then, you know, after a while we look at it and we try to kind of polish it the way we each see it going, you know, and that's where the arguments might take place, you know, where the piece is going. Chad might envision it in one way, or I envision it in a whole other way, and that's when you have to bitch a little bit and, you know, decisions. But that's it. But it's a fruitful way to work.
Yeah, I think it's good as well. Yeah, because like sometimes if you're making music in a vacuum and things like that, you know, you've got no feedback. And I think a lot of the time, like, feedback can really help, you know, it can really change something, you know, as opposed to sometimes you just think if you're doing it yourself, you think, oh, it's great, and it's like, because it's just you, but then you've got no pushback from anywhere, if you know what I mean.
Oh, no, I mean, criticism, I thrive on criticism, and it's like you say, you know, you might be working in a vacuum and, you really can't get any, I don't know, you can't necessarily be subjective about it. No, you can't be objective about it, excuse me. But I also think that working with other people, yeah, it forces you into it forces me out of my comfort zone. and when I work by myself, I just can get in a very deep rut, kind of repeating what I'd normally do,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what you mean, and that is interesting. I suppose it's all like dynamics and things like that. Like, it's all different when working with other people. But Paul, there's something I was going to ask you as well, and I'm always interested in this because every time, when you hear people or read interviews with musicians, they always talk about like who are your influences, and we did talk about that, but the thing that doesn't get talked about a lot of the time is non-musical influences. So is there any kind of really big non-musical influences that have made a big difference to your music?
No, there aren't really. I mean, when I was a kid and I saw Eraserhead, that kind of blew my mind. I mean, I was young. That was probably, like 78. I don't know when it first came out. And it was just, I went to see it probably 3-4 times in a row in an empty theater, the Brattle up in Boston in the wintertime. And that was really kind of a, life-changing experience for me. When I was a little kid and I saw Clockwork Orange for the first time when I was probably about 10, that was a really life-changing, time for me. But no, I mean, literature, generally film, poetry, they don't really inform what I do musically. I've always been very, very focused. My interests have been always sonically focused. So it's always sound for me. But the atmospheres that, some directors create kind of has permeated, like Lynch.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I'm a David Lynch fan myself, actually. And
do you like the new Twin Peaks?
I have not seen it yet. I'm not there yet.
It's way, way, way out in another realm.
In a good way?
I'm not sure. I mean, I like parts of it a lot. It's just, it's so completely, it's very amorphous, like if you're thinking that you're going to figure a storyline out or anything, I think there's 18 episodes and I'm up to about episode 10 and it just kind of hasn't gelled. The pieces haven't coalesced at all, really. It's very, very abstract.
No, I haven't started it yet. It's one of those things that I'm meaning to start.
But he was great.
What are you saying, Paul? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I just said early Lynch, like, before he was a known quantity, before he was kind of Mr. Weirdness, like when I saw Eraserhead, there was really not much I could have compared to it at the time. It was like hearing the Stooges for the first time, listening to Funhouse. It was just something very, very, it was a really deep kind of experience for me. So that in some way shaped maybe an aesthetic for me.
No, I can understand that because Eraserhead was a big thing for me as well because, I mean, like, I'd been obviously, like, born way after the fact. Like, I was born in the 80s, right? So, like, industrial music and that I'd heard as a teenager, and obviously it started in, like, the 70s and things. So, like, I was coming back to that early on. And I'd been into industrial music and things, Throbbing Gristle, all this stuff for a long time. And then I watched Eraserhead in, like, my 20s. And I was amazed by the sound design. That was something that that was what really stood out for me. And then I looked at what the time was, and it was round about, it was the late 70s, wasn't it? It was about, it 77 or something like that? And I know they worked on the sound design for about a year, but the sound design was so industrial as well. And it was interesting to me how that was kind of happening parallel in America. But then in, like, England, you had, like, the Gristle and that going on at the time. And I found that quite interesting how, like, there was that sort of parallel development. I don't know how much was influenced by whatever, but like, I just found it quite interesting, if you know what I mean.
Well, Lynch, I think, I mean, I may be mistaken, but I think he was working on Eraserhead for about 9 years,
It was a long time, yeah.
And he was really, I mean, you can see in his early films, he's really influenced by the Dadaists and, the early Surrealists. Mm-hmm, yeah. But yeah, the sound design was fascinating. And it's always been, I mean, I think Lynch has always just had a very interesting ear for music and, kind of, I think, like people like Scorsese, sometimes songs are defined by the way they're used in those films, like some of the work that he did in Blue Velvet, Candy Colored Clown. I mean, that song for me is redefined. It was redefined forever hearing that. Yes. Yeah, that early Lynch stuff it was really inspiring.
See, later on as well, the David Lynch one, I kind of like later on. I would say most out of the other ones, I really like Lost Highway. I thought that was a really cool film. Like, I enjoyed Lost Highway.
I liked Lost Highway. I only saw it once, but I was really, really moved by like the first two, I guess. Eraserhead and Blue Velvet. Those were the films for me. Mm. But it's funny, Blue Velvet, I saw it recently and it kind of dated, I never thought Lynch would date, but Blue Velvet Velvet dated. But Clockwork Orange, that was another huge piece for me. But I was much younger. I was only probably in like 5th or 6th grade when I'd experienced it. But that dazzled me beyond belief.
Yeah, and seeing that, like, I saw that as well, A Clockwork Orange, kind of early on, when I was kind of like, you know, a teenager, you know, and we were like hanging out with your mates and you watch something you're not supposed to watch, and it was like A Clockwork Orange. And I can understand that stuff with Kubrick because he had so much depth to his films, and he had so much, like, the fact that he would like do the editing, the producing, he would rewrite the script and things like that, you know, like I can kind of understand his like control freakery in a way because he was kind of a genius.
Oh, he was a genius. I never knew much about his process. I didn't know those things. But, you know, even like some of the music using Ligeti and Penderecki and The Shining, I mean, some of the pieces and the way he'd, you know, again, weave music and imagery into a, you know, just, it was indelible sometimes with those directors. Well, I guess in the UK it wasn't shown for a long, long time, right?
It was banned originally, I think it was, because of the content.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, he put it out and kids are seeing it and they're kind of reenacting crimes and doing shit like that, and I guess he just didn't want it shown in the UK.
Well, I read an article, and I don't know how true this is, but it said that John Bonham from Led Zeppelin at times used to go out getting drunk with his mates dressed as the Droogs in London. So,
yeah,
if they were doing that.
That's interesting. I don't doubt it. But he was the guy with the bowler hat and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Suspenders. Yeah. That's I could see that.
I know, Paul, that like there's some, before we get into like your kind of newer stuff, there's some reissues coming out this year, isn't there?
There's a reissue of the Headcrack album that's coming out, but there were a bunch of reissues that had come out last summer with Larva Lumps.
Yeah.
There were about, I guess, 4 or 5 of them. One of them was a Broken Flag cassette called Distress Signals. Mm-hmm. Is that, I don't know, is that what you're referring to?
I just noticed on your Facebook page there was like reissues of things like Headcrack and things like that. I noticed you had a thing like for people to choose what cover they thought looked better.
Oh yeah, I mean the label put that up. I had nothing to do with that. You know, I had sent them painting that I wanted to use, and they wanted to use the original cover. So I guess, you know, they kind of put that out, and it seems purists like the original cover, but I've changed the content of the album a little bit to make it what I thought was the record I wanted it to be. So, you know, you never know how purists are going to react. They might not like that reissue.
Do you find you have that problem?
You know, I mean, it's a funny thing because I hate it when something comes out. I've waited for a certain reissue comes out and the artist fucks with the songs or adds a mix that I hate, you know, and doesn't include the thing that I've been waiting for. So as a fan, you know, I've experienced it. So, you know, I don't know. But yeah, Headcrack was tricky for me because I really, really disliked 2 of the pieces on it. And I thought those 2 pieces really, I think they always marred the record. I thought they were just poorly done. They didn't make sense for the album. And so, I changed the album around, you know, the vinyl. Mm-hmm. But that's going to be reissued. And then there's a 10 CD box set of, stuff that we had done in the 80s, that's in the works. I don't know when that's coming out. That'll probably come out in a couple of years' time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's strictly a CD box.
You tell us as well about, like, because I've kind of looked at, obviously it's not out yet, I think it's the 4th of August, I believe, that remix album is coming out, the kind of Larva Lumps remix album, and there's a lot of big people doing remixes on it, so tell us a bit about that, Paul.
Yeah, Carving Songs, it's, you know, it's funny because I don't even consider it a remix record. I mean, to me, it was the most work I've done on any project probably in my life. I mean, it was a tremendous undertaking, and I didn't think it was going to be. I just figured, you know, people get the stems of songs and they reinterpret them. But it really did keep, you know, just keeping artists on tasks, trying to get all of the work, and then really being kind of a pain in the ass, and maybe working with some of the artists to take the reconfigurations of songs a little deeper. You know, I know my musical partner Chad, he told me that I had big balls in asking people work remixes. You know, people doing this work, and you have the balls to tell them that you know that the remix needs to be done a little bit better, or, you know, maybe that it needs some more work. And you know, but all the artists were really, really, they were great, and they worked so hard to reinterpret the pieces. So yeah, there are very few pieces that really resemble the original mixes. I mean, they really have become very much their own compositions. I'm really proud of the record. I love it. Carving songs, though, I mean, like, some of the mixes just blew me away. And I think so many of the mixes were so much better than the original compositions. You know, they just kind of, so it's very much, I think it's just very much a creative project on its own. You know, the remix thing, it kind of, I mean, I don't like remix records very much. And again, that's why I wanted to do this, because we'd never done a remix record, you know, ever in all the time that Controlled Bleeding's been existent. And this just seemed like, I don't know, it was a project that took its own life, and the songs really, they're beautiful creations unto themselves.
And that must have been quite interesting, though, like, yourself, like, you know, like, you make these songs, you make the stems available, and then just to hear how other people interpret them, I mean, that must be quite interesting as well, you know, like, just for yourself as a music guy.
It was fascinating. It was really interesting. And, you know, and for some of them, I just had no idea how they even approached them, like Ronaldo and the Loaf. You know, Ronaldo and the Loaf, those guys that, you know, work with the Residents, and they've got, you know, three. And, you know, just they did such a great, fascinating interpretation. I just had no idea where they came up with the ideas to expand really what was a very simple little piece called As Evening Fades. I mean, they just took it and made this incredible 6-minute opus. So, I don't like it being kind of lumped in as remix records, because when I think of remix records, I think of stuff that's just kind of tossed off and, you know, interim projects to kind of keep momentum going for a band. This was a really intensive and difficult project to finally see it released. I mean, it did. It took a solid, I don't know, it took a solid year.
See, I think a little bit differently about sort of what I would call a remix record, because, like, I grew up, like, my dad was in, like, a big folk band and things like that. That was kind of, like, played folk and country music and that sort of thing. So I grew up with that kind of music, and then you would always hear, like, you know, everyone's covered everyone's songs, and then, like, you'd always get these, you know, these cover albums. And then when I got into punk music and that, being younger, like, again, punk covers of pop songs and all that kind of thing, and then getting into, like, other things, like things that were popular when I was younger, like Nine Inch Nails, and they had a lot of remix albums. So for me, it never seemed like, it always just seemed like I loved hearing imaginings, like, of other songs, like, whether it be, like, you know, the kind of remix album, whether it's something like industrial or electronic, or whether it's like a kind of like rock band or folk band or whatever, but people are like, say something like, for example, there was a great Johnny Cash cover album, and, like, the one song that stood out for me totally, Stevie Tombstone doing Folsom Prison Blues, this kind of thing, like, people reimagining songs and making it their own thing has always been, like, something, like, I've loved, because if I like the song anyway, and then if I like the person that's doing it, usually, like, I just love the two versions, like, I'll listen to both of them. I love how a song can not just be one thing, it can be whatever you imagine it as, if you know what I mean.
Oh, I do. And that's why it was so interesting to see how this project evolved, because we'd never done one, you know. You know, and I know that I'd been invited to do remixes, and a lot of times, you know, maybe I wouldn't put the greatest effort into it, you know, or maybe I wouldn't even really know how to approach a song. So I found, you know, it's always a really hard task, I think, to be, you know, being asked to do it. So yeah, I was really excited by the results of it.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So Paul, we'll start to wrap up kind of here now. There's one question I'm interested in, like, and this might be like a kind of weird one, but I think it could be interesting. So if you could go back and speak to yourself when you just started, when you were just kind of getting started, what would you say to yourself?
You know, I would say something, I mean, my great frustration, I think, as I've moved through, you know, creating music and probably putting out way more records than I should have, is I would have said, you know, slow down and really sit and live with the music before you release it, before you make it public. Because my problem has always been one of quality control. I think back in the early days, I'd be so excited about just, you know, having the opportunity to make the work public, to make records. I mean, you know, in the early recordings, that I think it was just kind of, you're in this creative frenzy, and everything you produce, you make available, and you don't really live with it long enough to realize that certain ideas are really inferior, that certain pieces aren't complete, or that certain pieces are just fucking garbage. What I'd say, just slow down. Don't feel that you have to be so prolific, or that, you have to work all the time. Just kind of sit with the music and make sure that it's exactly the way you want it, that it's articulated exactly as it should be, because I just have a lot of regrets about some of the early records, records like maybe, what's the record? Curd, that was one where the album I thought was just really, there was a lot of fucking just poor performances, it could have been so much better. And redoing it for CD, I could repair some of the problems, which was kind of interesting. But the vinyl, or even like Music for Scourging Grounds, in terms of the way it was mastered and things that I did it was a beautiful album, but really flawed because I was very careless in some ways. So, that's what I tell myself, just to be more of a perfectionist, I suppose.
I think that's really great advice, actually, Paul, and good to start to leave on. So, as we start to wrap up here, is there anything you want to plug and stuff like that? Obviously, we talked about Carving Songs. I believe it's out on the 4th of August.
The CD is on the 4th of August. I think the LP is going to be available something like 2 weeks after that. So yeah, I'm just excited about Carving Songs. I'd like people to hear it. But yeah, I'm done. I don't have anything else to share.
And have you got any ideas for the future, or are you just seeing how it goes just now?
Vlad, we're working intensively on new music. I'd like to complete the recordings that we're doing by December, and maybe see a new full length band recording, maybe issued in a year from now, maybe next August or September. But yeah, we're working pretty diligently on new pieces.
That's amazing, Paul. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it. I think it's been a really interesting conversation.
Vlad, it's been really nice talking to you. Thanks for doing it. I appreciate your support and interest.
I'd like to thank Paul for coming on the show. It's a great conversation. I really enjoyed having him on. And thanks so much for listening. So the website, Bresnix.com, BRESNIX.com. And to finish off today's show, here's the opening song from Controlled Bleeding's new album. This is TROD, Defiler's Song.
Shadow of a fool's destination, a climber inside of a world of defecation.